Would you be willing to pay more money for solar panels if they generated more power? And how do you know how much more power is worth it? Well, to answer this, what we really need to know is how much more power can they generate, as well as how much more money do they cost? Over the years, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos about bifacial gain. And while I am thankful for those because they did ultimately lead to me buying my own bifacial panels, I always took a little bit of an issue with the way some of them were done. Most of the time, it's just two panels, one covered, one uncovered. And while this sounds great in theory, and I understand why they do it, because it's easy to set up, it's easy to film, and technically it would scale with whatever size array you were using, the problem is I feel that small-scale studies don't usually equate to real-world results at the same size and scale as what you're assuming. So it is important to note that I can't both have an array covered and uncovered at the same time to get the same data points. And while I did want the whole day's worth of data to make sure that it was valid, I needed a set of comparative data points. Luckily, I do have something similar. Enter the solar pergola and the solar carport. So the best thing about the carport is this is the exact same panel in the exact same size array as the winter array. This should allow me to compare the uncovered array on day 1 to the covered array on day 2 to calculate how much power I would have generated had it been uncovered that day as well. And now for the real reason that everyone probably clicked on this video. Why in the world did I use blankets to cover these? Well, there were a few reasons. The first one was that whenever I put the tarps on, they let a lot more light through than I wanted, and I was afraid it would skew the results. The second reason is the size of these arrays are actually kind of deceptive. They're much larger than they look, and I didn't have enough tarps. And the third reason, if I'm being honest, I kind of thought it would make a cool thumbnail. And if you guys are being honest, you did click on it. So, that out of the way, how did we do, you ask? Well, let's get into some numbers. Slightly higher yield on day 2 than day 1, and this was mostly due to some fog in the morning on day 1. But the solar pergola generated 24.6 on day 1 and 28 kilowatts on day 2. The winter array produced 28.9 on day 1 and 4.8 on day 2. And the carport generated 26.3 on day 1 and 29.4 kilowatts on day 2. So if we look at 28, that is 114% of the 24.6. Likewise, 29.4 is 112% of 26.3. That means that if I average the 114 and the 112, I get my 113. That means that if I had 28.9 kilowatts on day 1, in theory, I would have generated 32.7 kilowatts on day 2. To further finish this, if I take the 4.8, that is 14.7% of the 32. So that means that my overall yield from bifacial gain alone was predicted by this study at 14.7% of the overall generation. So 14.7%, while respectable, is lower than I was assuming it would be, and I think I have an idea why. But to really justify it, we need to look at the individual solar curves for each one of the arrays on both days. So this is the time of day that I was talking about that we had some fog that had rolled in. We're going to roll over and we're going to look at the peaks. Now this day again was a little bit cooler, so I got slightly higher peaks for my data than I do for the following day. And it's actually very dependent on temperature as to how high the peak you will typically make. But you'll see that on array 2, which is the winter array, I made a little over 4,600. On the solar carport, I made almost 4,300, and on the pergola, I made about 4,100. When we look at the data for day 2, the pergola and the carport have very nearly the perfect bell curve that I would expect to see on a full sun, no cloud day. And this makes a lot of sense because it was a beautiful day. However, when I look at the actual output from the winter array, we see a lot of peaks and a lot of valleys, which seems odd to me, as the only thing that could likely cause that would be shadow or quite possibly heat. Now, if you do remember from the picture, I actually did cover some of those panels with a comforter. And as these are all wired in series, that means that they'll all drop to the lowest production panel in the entire array. Another thing to note is, if I can roll over a decent dip here, this dips, and many of the dips,
corresponds to a peak on the other two arrays, which leads me to believe even more firmly that this is likely a limitation due to heat and not shading. All right, when we further expand this out, it's really pronounced how much of a peak and trough we're seeing here. So pretty big power swings, not a whole lot of time differences here. So if we look at this one, this peak occurred at about 11:20. This one occurred at about 10:36. So I really don't think that's enough time for the sun to have shifted enough to account for this much of a power reduction. In addition to that, the peak was actually lower than I was assuming this was going to be. So I think this leads even more credence to the fact that this was probably a heat limitation and not necessarily a shading problem. I saw more peak power production than this whenever I just lifted the initial 8 panels from the ground up to the mount that they're already sitting in. I was really expecting this to hit anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200 watts, and we barely hit half that.
Well, what have we here? You guys didn't really think I'd make a bifacial gain video and not have snow in it, did you? This was the first sunny day after Snowmageddon this year, and also the inspiration for this entire video. Unfortunately, bifacial solar panels are so good at what they do that everything melted off before I got enough data for it to be very useful. The original plan here was to both see how long it took for the snow to melt off the bifacial panels, as well as how much bifacial gain I was generating before that happened. Unfortunately, as you can see, by around 11 o'clock, larger chunks of ice started melting off of the winter array, and shortly thereafter they started melting off the solar carport as well. Now, the pergola was blocked by snow sliding down off of it, but then hitting the roof and piling up, so it kind of didn't really have anywhere to go. But the real star of the show here is going to be peak solar production from the winter array. Now keep in mind, this is only a 4,800 watt rated array, and we were generating 5,426 watts, which is pretty awesome. And while one day's data could be chalked up to just a generic fluke, this was the following day, producing peaks very nearly as high as the first day. In addition to that, this was the day after that. And while we did have some melting snow, and we didn't see quite as high of a peak, the real star of the show here is the fact that we produced greater than 100% of this capacity between 12 o'clock and 15:30. That is pretty outstanding. So what's the end all here? Well, I think the important takeaway here is that you realize that no matter what, in any lighting circumstance, you're definitely generating a meaningful amount of extra power when you're using bifacial panels. And while that range can really change depending on how much light, how much sun there is outside, especially in low light situations, you'll get an outsized increase. And if you're like me, you really rely on that on some of the shadier days of the year. Now that we have an idea about how much more power we will generate, we need to look at the other half of the equation. How much more do solar panels cost when you're buying bifacial, or should you just stick with monofacial? Well, for those of you familiar with my build, you know that I'm a pretty big fan of Signature Solar. Almost all of my equipment came exclusively from them when I had the opportunity. So let's pop over to the website there and see what's on sale currently. Due to the differences in pricing strategies across manufacturers, I think the easiest way to compare this is going to be the lowest cost option from both a bifacial and monofacial standpoint. So this HT panel actually comes in at 34 cents per watt, and this Phonon panel comes in at almost 28 cents per watt. In this example, that makes the bifacial panel approximately 22% more expensive than the monofacial. Though I should probably note that by the time you buy a comparably sized panel, it may cost even more to buy monofacial. There is one more important point that I haven't touched on at all, and that is longevity. Solar panels that are bifacial always outlast the monofacial counterparts. And the reason for that is typically when there's a failure, it's moisture into the backer, and that allows corrosion, which degrades the panel, which makes it to stop working. And you can tell that this is the case because all of your bifacial panels are rated for longer and have longer warranties. So if this truly is a long-term investment, I say the only intelligent way to go is just go ahead and buy the bifacial panels. Even if you don't manage to produce more power because it's on a flat roof and you can't get any sun behind it, you still have a panel that lasts longer. To me, that makes it worth it. Well guys, that's it for this one. If you hung around this long, thanks for your time. I know everyone has important things to do, and if you could, like and subscribe, and I'll try to put out some more content. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.